Hi, and welcome to the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. Premium thought at a wholesale price. Let's think big things together and learn philosophical insights from master minds. I'm your host, Romans 9:18, a.k.a. the Scholastic Serendipity, a.k.a. Calvinist Klein. Today's essay follows up on an earlier essay starting on the topic of moral philosophy by Joseph Rickaby. Paraphrased for the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. Here is an excerpt from Herodotus. Xerxes the king looked at the plain to his army and at the shore of his mighty fleet of warriors, and he was satisfied by it. And yet, after a moment, he started to cry. The king's uncle, Artabanus, came to ask what was wrong with the monarch. Xerxes thoughtfully replied, "There came upon me a sudden pity when I thought of the shortness of human life. I realized that of this entire host of forces, numerous and powerful, not one will be alive 100 years from now." Artabanus replied, "And yet there are still things more sad in the world. Short as our time is, because of trouble, sickness, and calamity, there is no person who hasn't wished at one time that he were dead rather than alive. I think that death is a blessing, and that God must be jealous and envious of it." So wrote that ancient Greek historian. It should be clear to all that happiness, as discussed earlier, is not fulfilled in this earthly life. Aristotle thought the idea something to be approximated or strived towards, and called his wise men happy, meaning in an imperfect way. He says of the perfection of the life of contemplation, "Such a life is too good for humankind, for it is not to our nature, but only as much as we have a divine element for us to enter into the virtue of contemplation. This virtue excels all others and excites anything into which it enters. We should ignore those who say it is our lot to remain with human thoughts only, and as far as it is in us, we should strive to put on the immortal and do all we can to live by the best of our nature. For even if the divine spark in us is small, in power and value, it outweighs the rest of our being. A person is no better than the principles that rules him. And it is best and sweetest for humankind to be ruled by this. It should go without saying that the ideal of happiness in an abstract and eternal way cannot be realized in this life. Aristotle thought the trajectory of our efforts could only asymptotically approach such a limit. Because we only approach and do not obtain such happiness in this life, does that mean we cannot obtain it? On the contrary, it is this difference between the actual and the ideal that fuels our desire. We are no longer indifferent to the difference, but find it a passion that drives us as a part of what it means to be human. It is a nature that is unique to humankind. Now, contentment is not the same as happiness. Contentment is the good, while happiness is the perfect. And it has been said, the good is the enemy of the perfect. Being content, while practical to some degree, is ultimately not the same as being happy. But in taking such an approach, are we not being unreasonable? Should we be limited by moderation, even in the search for the perfection of happiness? How can we philosophically unify the distinctive concepts? If there were no cause and effect, then anything might come from anything, and it would not make sense to speak of a thing having a nature. But in that sense, nature implies a regular and definite flow of tendencies. One thing leads to another. Something springs into another thing. And of course, from nothing, nothing comes. How can the determinism of this causal order be reconciled with the freedom and moral agency of people? It is beyond our providence to resolve it here. But at least let us say that a natural agent is opposed to a free one, and that our creation is the starting point of our nature. But it seems that all things proceed from one state to another end, determined by an impersonal process, unless it be interrupted by the activity of an agent. Everything that happens is a part of some sequence of causality. There are no loose facts in nature, and the chains of tendencies link each successive event in time and space together. And so the universe is held and doesn't simply break down into nothingness in a universal and absolute way. We see this in organic beings like plants and animals. Living things are a compound of parts, each acting by their nature. And at every state, nature can interact with being in a multitude of ways. That is, there are potentially many transitions corresponding to the parts of things. And philosophy deals with their union in describing what is common to each class of living beings. Thus, philosophy, in that sense, is not concerned with individuals per se, but rather with the species. The particulars of a Bucephalus or Alexander are but manifestations of the Cartesian product of anthropological possibilities in humankind itself. One interesting thing observed is that not everything in an organism contributes to its good. There is refuse material to get rid of. There are morbid growths and a tendency to decay, and sooner or later those build until the organism perishes. When thinking about such things, Aristotle came to an interesting conclusion that some have called the only indisputable axiom in philosophy, namely, the idea that nature does nothing in vain. Ascribing a wisdom and sense of purpose and design to reality that seems so obvious as to be undeniable. But on with happiness. It seems that the desire for happiness is not an accident or defect of human nature, but a perfection of it, and the end for which people seem to have been created. In that regard, happiness doesn't seem to be a declension or a form of decay or disease or unwholesome, but is rather a property of the human race itself. It seems at its most feeble early in the life of a person, in their childhood, when desires are simplest and most easily satisfied, and at its strongest late in life, when the mental faculty is most vigorous. This desire seems to not be a waste of energy, but a good motive that focuses all of human activity. However, the issue of the possibility of happiness is now brought up. It seems that happiness would be a vain desire and not for the better if it were essentially an unobtainable end. That is, if there were no perfection ultimately available to humankind. But since we have already noted earlier that the fulfillment is not for this life, it leads us to speculatively conclude that there must be a life after this one for which we are made. Otherwise, the desire for happiness is in vain, and humankind is a vanity of vanities. Some people think that there is a virtue even with the unfulfilled state, just like in the Middle Ages, the desire for transmuting lead into gold was a positive aim. In striving to make gold from lead, even though it was an impossible ideal, yet still growth and progress and good things came about in the science of chemistry. And there were so many other useful and meaningful discoveries. So what should be said about happiness? That it is an unobtainable idea that we should still strive for in striving for the unobtainable, we shall have the benefit from what is obtainable? What a pickle humankind finds itself in. As one philosopher put it, I have studied people and nature, and have passed many long nights observing the heavens, and where has it led me? Simply to this, that the life of humankind is a nothing, that people are nothing, and that we will never penetrate the mysteries of the universe. We are meant only for the grave, and hope for speedy annihilation. Our lamp goes out, and nothing we can do can relight it. And so, nature, I return to you, to be reunited with you forever. And never have you received a more unhappy being. The danger for despair in thinking along these lines is therefore obvious. For the Philosopher's Clearinghouse, this is Romans 9:18.